Here we are on a bright sunny day in January. January is often a month of harsh reality. It's a time for sweeping up pine needles, throwing away tinsel, time for making budgets, planning, trying to figure out how we will take a stand against growing balances. Time to fight back against the numbers on the scale that tend to go up when the temperatures go down. A time to put away frivolity and settle down to the ordinary tasks of life that are at hand. It's a time for resolution. Many of you stayed after the meeting last week. You were better than I to help put away the decorations of the church. The tree that sat here was, decorated by all the ornaments that you brought to church. And slowly last week, I'm sure it was unadorned until it was nothing but bare branches. A tree for the month of January, a month that is a pragmatist's delight, a time for buckling down and plodding ahead. With heavy footfalls, we make our way into the new year. Here, a short distance in, we happen along this story about the baptism of Jesus. It seems strange to meet up with it here. Its placement here was a matter of theological debate between Eastern and Western churches, and I'm not sure if anybody really remembers why, and if they did, the reasons would be obscure. But for whatever reason, we leave the Magi and we lurch forward to Jesus being baptized by John. Jesus comes to John to be baptized, but John knows who he is. And he says, I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me? Jesus convinces him that it's a January thing, doing what needs to be done. He says, it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness. And the story from there is a familiar one you've heard before. And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." So the young child, who the Magi visited just last week, is now all grown up and receiving God's blessing. Isn't that just like life? Infancy, childhood, and adolescence pass by all in a wink. Yet through it all, the Spirit of God hovers like a dove. Holiness infuses the ordinary. Epiphany is a word we use to talk about a realization that suddenly dawns upon us, a moment that draws us up out of the ordinary flow of our lives and casts a bright light on something we couldn't see before but now is staring us right in the face. In the next few weeks before Lent begins, we will hear about other epiphanies in the life of Jesus when God's presence is suddenly made known. And when you hear these stories, don't just accept them as further evidence that Jesus is extraordinary. He is, and we are definitely ordinary in comparison to Jesus. But the point is that God's presence sparks in our lives as well. Going about your usual day, you may stumble into an instant when the ordinary is suddenly transformed into a means of grace. There are moments when everyday occurrence, like light through leaves, the cry of a baby, a passing smile, all of a sudden become a portal to a deeper source that holds everything together. There are times when the humdrum world is revealed for what it really is, an intricate creation animated by the breath of God. Baptism is certainly one of these moments, and I suppose that unlike most of you, I was baptized by immersion at the age of 8. I attended classes for a year with a wise and stern teacher who tried to make sure that I was ready to make a commitment to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And when the time came, it was a very big day for my family. My mother had purchased and I'm sure pressed new white clothes, as was the practice. My father had a set too because he was the elder doing the baptizing. And we had practiced a lot at our local YMCA in the swimming pool. So I was all ready to hold my nose when I went under the water. My church didn't have a baptismal font, so we went to a nearby church, and it was unfamiliar, seemed strange. The baptismal font was actually concealed behind very nice red drapes. And I think my father and I made our way through a labyrinth of basement doors and circular stairs until we came to this still water. And he led me out into it, this chest-high water, while the congregation began to sing a hymn. And I think somebody didn't get the cue quite right because the red drapes just magically opened, and there I was, standing in freezing water in front of the whole congregation. And it must have been a good hymn because it seemed like they just went on and on and on and got more devout in their determination to sing that song. And after so many verses, my teeth were chattering so badly that I looked at my father to see if he could tell that I was freezing. And he was looking at me with alarm. And apparently he wasn't the only one, because I looked out in the congregation to see that the kids who were not singing were actually pointing at me and giggling. And then I felt a little bit better because I saw their parents scolding them and shaking their fingers at them. But by the time the hymn finally wound down, my whole body was shaking. And when my father finally pushed me under that cold water, I jumped up praising the Lord. I'm not sure I understood what it meant to be saved from sin, but I knew what it felt like to be saved from that cold water. Even though this experience had entirely too much of the ordinary in it, the presence of God could not be missed. It was just an ordinary kid, plain old cold water, and the timeless chorus of obnoxious boys, and yet God used it to make my life into something it wasn't before. Our lives are filled with moments of epiphany. In the tasks of our everyday lives, God is present to us, giving meaning to empty minutes and eternal substance to the passing years. We do what needs to be done, the dishes, the laundry, picking up, putting away. But through it all, God is there. It is easy to forget that God is present when we are just going about the tasks of our usual lives. When we read the Gospels, we tend to think of the times when Jesus lived as magical. We don't read much about all the everyday drudgery that carried life along. Most of the people we read about were ordinary folk, people who did commonplace things like tended sheep, draw water from a well, or walk on dusty roads. And yet we read their stories because their ordinary lives were filled with the extraordinary inbreaking of God. They are not so different from us. Their world is not so different from our own. God is always pouring the precious gift of grace into our lives in the hope that we will stop and drink deeply. One of my favorite authors, Brittany may be tired of hearing from this author, Annie Dillard, has written, "Experiencing the present purely is being emptied and hollow. You catch grace as a man fills his cup under a waterfall. The waterfall is always there, every moment of every day. Much of the time, we are dying of thirst, living parched lives, and all we have to do is stop and listen for that life-giving sound." In Seeds of Contemplation, Thomas Merton writes, "Every moment and every event of every person's life on earth plants something in the soul. For just as the wind carries thousands of winged seeds, so each moment brings with it germs of spiritual vitality that come to rest imperceptibly in the minds and wills of men and women. We must learn to realize that the love of God seeks us in every situation and seeks our good. God's inscrutable love seeks our awakening. If I were looking for God, every event and every moment would sow in my will grains of God's life that would spring up one day in a tremendous harvest. So the ground outside now is fallow. The snow is still there, insulating the seeds against the harsh cold. Yet we know that in a few months we will look expectantly until we see a green shoot poke its way through the ground outside the doors of the church. Even now that annual miracle is being prepared. May it be the same in your life. God is cultivating seeds in your life. God is taking what is, pouring in grace, and growing what can be. If we can claim the time to stop and pay attention to God's constant work, God's ever-present gift of grace, perhaps we can begin to see the holiness of our everyday lives. Perhaps we, like Thomas Merton, can see that everything comes from God. And even in fallow times, God is bringing about growth. He writes, "For it is God's love that warms me in the sun, and God's love that sends the cold rain. It is God's love that feeds me in the bread I eat, and God that feeds me also by hunger and fasting. It is the love of God that sends the winter days when I am cold and sick, and the hot summer when I labor and my clothes are full of sweat. But it is God who breathes on me with light winds off the river and in the breezes out of the wood. God's love spreads the shade of the sycamore over my head." As we make our way on the hard scrabble path through this month of January, I pray that the Spirit of God will descend upon you to lighten the tasks of living. May God give you the reassurance that however you may be, energetic or tired, hard-nosed or hopeful, you are God's beloved. Amen.
You've been listening to a sermon by our guest, Reverend Raymond Clothier, Associate Chaplain of Bates College, filling in this week for Reverend Stephen Carnahan, pastor of High Street Congregational Church in Auburn, Maine. If you feel inspired by what you hear, we invite you to join us in person for worship services every Sunday morning, beginning at 10 o'clock. Of course, you can always listen to our church sermons on the web. New sermons are posted every Monday by midday. Please take a moment to explore this website for more information about our church, or visit our Facebook page at High Street Congregational Church, UCC. We hope that God's presence will be known to you every hour of every day. May God's blessings rest upon you, now and always. See you next week.